There are two paths in life. One leads to heaven, and the other leads to hell. The path which leads to heaven is called virtue. The path which leads to hell is called sin. To be clear, I'm not talking about the sort of literal heaven and hell that fundamentalist Christians believe in. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm primarily interested in this life, not in what happens after we die. If you're an atheist, or if you follow one religion or another, that doesn't concern me. I'm not attempting to change your beliefs. I'm only calling your attention to your thoughts, words, and actions, and asking you to consider the direction in which they're taking you, and whether or not that's the destination you desire. If you've ever heard an argument between a Christian and an atheist, I'm sure you've heard the atheist object that the belief in hell is inconsistent with the belief in a good and loving God. They'll say that no good and loving God would create a place like hell and send people to it. And I'm sure you've heard the Christian answer that God doesn't send anyone to hell. They'll say that people choose to go to hell by rejecting God. My opinion is that the Christian is making an ad hoc argument in order to defend their religious beliefs against the atheist's perfectly valid criticism. But I don't want to get pulled into that argument here. I only mention it because I agree with the Christian to a certain extent, from a certain perspective. God doesn't send anyone to hell. People choose hell when they choose the path of sin and reject the path of virtue. The universe is governed by the law of causality. Every cause has an effect. Every choice has a consequence. Our choices in life often bring unintended consequences. As they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. People don't intend to suffer from a really bad hangover. They just intend to drink and have a good time. Over the ages, wise men have observed the consequences of different choices. They learned from their own mistakes and from the mistakes of others. They saw that there were choices that resulted in happiness and others that brought suffering. It might be impossible to identify every possible choice in life or to predict every possible outcome of every choice. But from ancient times, the wise have learned to see beneath the surface and identify patterns and principles that govern human actions. There's a principle they came to know as courage that manifests itself in countless different acts. But behind each of these acts, they recognized the principle of courage. And they saw that courageous actions created positive outcomes. Every hero myth tells the story of a man of courage who brings salvation to his people. Courage leads to salvation and victory. A failure of courage leads to destruction and defeat. So courage is a virtue, and cowardice is a sin. Cowardice is a deficiency of courage. So there is a kind of sin which is the result of a deficiency of a particular virtue. But there's also another kind of sin, which is the result of an excess of a particular virtue. Courage, taken to excess, becomes rash. And so every virtue is a balance between two extremes. Aristotle developed this idea quite a bit in his Ethics, and so have many other wise men throughout history in different parts of the world. This is because the virtues are not human constructs. They are timeless truths which reveal themselves to anyone who carefully observes the operation of the law of cause and effect in human actions. These laws are as objective and inviolable as the laws of chemistry. I recommend meditating on the classical virtues. The 7 heavenly virtues and the 7 deadly sins are worthy of consideration. But I think the flaw is that this list presents virtue and vice as pairs of opposites, instead of presenting virtue as a balance between two opposite extremes. The danger with this is that it can tend to result in falling into the opposite sin. For example, if pride is understood to be the deadly sin, and humility is thought of as the opposite extreme, then the result is just a swing to the opposite extreme. If there are 7 heavenly virtues, then there are 14 deadly sins, not just 7. The Catholic Church has ended up with a list of 7 deadly sins and 7 even deadlier sins, because the deadliest sins are those that disguise themselves as virtue. Lust is listed as a deadly sin, and chastity is listed as the opposite virtue. This is completely wrong. Lust isn't a sin. It isn't a sin to have lust. The sin is giving in to lust to the point of overindulgence. So the deadly sin isn't lust, but indulgence. And chastity isn't a virtue. Chastity is abstinence. Abstinence is the opposite of indulgence. Abstinence is the even deadlier sin, because it disguises itself as virtue. It's even more harmful to repress your desires than it is to express them. Whatever you repress becomes unconscious. It becomes perverted. It's become a cliché that a Catholic priest takes a vow of chastity and represses his natural sexual desire for women, and then finds himself overpowered by unnatural lust for young boys. The same is true of pride. Pride isn't a sin, and humility isn't a virtue. Pride only becomes sinful if taken to excess. Then it becomes hubris. A deficiency of pride is also a sin, and humility is an even deadlier sin because it disguises itself as a virtue. We can see a perfect example of this in Western European nations at the moment, in the form of toxic white guilt. This is a deficiency in racial pride. White supremacism is the opposite extreme. It represents an excess of racial pride. I'm against white supremacism, and I'm against white guilt. I think white people, and people of other races, should feel a sense of pride in their racial identity. And I'm against people of any race committing acts of hatred and violence against people of any race. We could say very much the same thing about the deadly sin of greed, and the contrary virtue of charity. Greed is usually defined as an excessive desire for wealth. We say that a person is being greedy if they take more than they need. Of course, we all need material resources. We all need money to live. But how much do we need? This is a hard question to answer. I think it's wise to save money and basically accumulate so-called excess wealth. What if you or a family member gets cancer? What if a flood destroys your home and you don't have flood insurance? What one person sees as greed and excess wealth, another person may see as wise planning for the future. I think it's more sensible to define greed as desiring more than what you've earned. I don't consider it greedy to want to earn a lot of money. I consider it greedy to want to take a lot of wealth that you haven't earned. A poor person who chooses to take advantage of the welfare system and live off of money stolen by the government through taxation from hardworking people who actually earned it, rather than go out and work to earn a living, is greedy. A rich businessman who earned his wealth by building a business that created jobs for people and provided goods or services that people wanted and were willing to pay for, is not greedy. Obviously, I'm not saying that all poor people are greedy, or that no rich people are, but it's equally absurd to claim the opposite. I'm only saying that greed is not the same thing as wealth. Greed isn't about having a lot or a little. It's about desiring more than you've earned by your own merit. But again, deficiency is as much of a sin as excess. Don't be ashamed to receive what you've earned. Don't be ashamed to charge what your work is worth. Charity is giving more to others than they've earned through their own merit. If they earned it, it isn't charity. So charity isn't a virtue. When one person gives another person more than they've earned through their own merit, the other person receives more than they've earned through their own merit. So charity and greed are complementary rather than contrary. They're two sides of the same coin. A virtuous person will give no more or less than is owed, and will receive no more or less than is earned. This is the ideal of the free market. And I believe in the virtue of capitalism. I believe in the sinfulness of the state. Whenever you find a person giving more or less than is owed, or receiving more or less than is earned, you'll almost inevitably find the hand of the state. This is because state power rests on coercion. A greedy person needs some form of coercion. He wants to take more than he's earned through his own merit. Others don't want to voluntarily give more than they owe. They don't want to give what they've earned to someone else who hasn't earned it. So the greedy person has to use coercion. And so greedy people are drawn to the government like flies to a rotting carcass, and always will be. Greedy people are horrified at the prospect of a truly free market. They'll always support statism. Socialists are greedy people, and they hypocritically point their fingers accusingly at the so-called greedy capitalist. It's no wonder that socialist revolutions always lead to hell on earth. Sin is the path to hell. I won't claim that anarcho-capitalism will lead to heaven on earth. I don't promote any such utopian vision. But I do know that the path of virtue will lead us in that direction. It's up to the human race how far it will go in that direction. It's up to each society how much it wants to promote sin and how much it wants to promote virtue. Although I'm an American and I love my country, I see that it's on the road to hell. And so is the rest of the world. In fact, the rest of the world is much closer to hell than America is. I'm not sure if any other nation can claim to be more virtuous than America. America may be the most virtuous nation on earth, but that isn't saying much in a world that's headed straight for hell. But it isn't that God is sending the world to hell. God isn't punishing the world for its disobedience. The world is simply ignorant of the law of causality. The road to hell is a journey of 1,000 miles that begins with a single step. It's not an inevitable destination. It's only inevitable if we continue taking steps in that direction. We can turn around and start walking in the other direction. There's a proverbial story about a man who tried to change the world, but he failed. So he decided to try to change his country, but he still failed. So he decided to try to change his community, but he failed again. So he decided to try to change himself. Gradually, he succeeded. And he became a light in his community. And gradually, his community changed. And his community became a light in his country. And gradually, his country changed and became a light to the whole world. And the whole world gradually changed. Be a light to the world. Each individual is a microcosm of the world. The world is a macrocosm of the individual. As below, so above. The law of correspondence applies here. When you overcome the power of Satan, or the demiurgos, within yourself, you weaken his power in the world. For anyone who may be new to my work, I don't believe in a literal Satan any more than I believe in a literal hell. But I use the symbol of Satan, which I associate with the demiurgos of Gnostic mythology, to point toward a spiritual or psychological entity, which is very real and powerful. He is the God of this world spoken of by the Apostle Paul. There's a lot to say about this entity, and I've been asked to go into more depth on the subject, but I'd like to save that topic for a future series of discussions. For now, I'd like to encourage you to spend some time studying the classical virtues, and especially the 4 cardinal virtues. There is broad agreement among the ancients on these 4. They are wisdom, or prudence, self-control, or temperance, courage, or fortitude, and fairness, or justice. The virtue of wisdom is about acting according to good judgment. It's recognizing the right course of action in a given situation. I associate this virtue with an understanding of the law of causality, and with the knowledge that there is a right time and place for everything. To act according to wisdom is to do the right thing at the right time. I'm only offering a brief summary of the virtues. There's more to all of them than simply what I'm describing. This is why I encourage you to study them for yourself. But wisdom, or prudence, has been called the mother of all virtues, and rightly so, I believe. It's almost better not to call wisdom a virtue at all, but to simply call it the mother of virtue. So you might justifiably say that there are only three cardinal virtues, and they are the sons or daughters of wisdom. They are temperance, courage, and justice. And I've actually already talked about these. Temperance comes from the realization that both deficiency and excess are sins. Most people who have a church background or who went to Sunday school as children will know that the word sin is a translation of an ancient word which means to miss the mark. The image is of an archer aiming for a target. He can miss to the left or to the right. He can aim too high or too low. In terms of music, temperance is a perfectly tuned guitar string, which is neither sharp nor flat. To deny that sin exists is like denying that there are flats and sharps. Only someone who is tone deaf can make a claim so ridiculous as that no instrument or singer can ever be off pitch. Denying that sin exists in the world is equally ignorant. But I don't use the word sin in the same way that religious fundamentalists do. The fact that a word has been corrupted through misuse doesn't mean that I can't still use the word in accordance with its original intended meaning and use it to point toward the truth. Justice is like temperance. The scales of justice can be imbalanced toward either side. Justice is collecting what is earned and paying what is owed. Anyone who's read Plato's Republic will know that simplistic definitions such as this can leave room for criticism. And I wouldn't like to argue with Socrates over what the most precise definition of justice is, but I believe this one points in the right direction. To use a Zen metaphor, this definition is nothing more than a finger pointing toward the moon. In my view, the intention of Socrates in deconstructing definitions of justice was very similar to that of the Zen master in the well-known Zen story, who cut off the boy's finger. I don't believe that story is true, by the way. I don't believe a Zen master actually cut a boy's finger off. I think the story is just meant to be shocking in order to make a point. When Socrates asked his companions, "What is justice?" This is like the Zen master asking his disciples, "What is Zen?" One of Plato's companions answered according to what he had been taught. He gave a correct Sunday school answer. The answer isn't wrong. The answer is correct. But a teacher like Socrates isn't satisfied by a student who gives a textbook answer. It isn't enough to simply repeat what you heard in class. Socrates destroyed this answer in order to point beyond it. Similarly, when the boy raised his finger in response to the question, "What is Zen?" just as he had seen the master do a number of times before, he was only imitating knowledge. The master had to cut off his finger. He had to cut away his false knowledge so that the boy could become enlightened. So now that Plato has published the Socratic dialogues and everyone has read the Republic, some ignoramus will hear me give a definition of justice such as the one I gave, and his head will swell up with intellectual pride. He'll see his opportunity to expose me for the fool I am and display his superior knowledge, and he'll regurgitate the same arguments Socrates gave in the Republic to try to destroy my definition. But he's doing exactly the same thing as the character in the dialogue. He's repeating what he read in the Republic. He's still missing the point. A young Zen student may have heard about the finger pointing at the moon, so now he imagines himself to be enlightened. But by focusing on the moon, he's making the same mistake as the boy who focused on the finger. The Zen master wasn't pointing to the moon. He was pointing toward the light of the sun reflected on the moon's surface. The person who thinks the master was merely pointing to the moon is just as unenlightened as the person who thinks the master was merely holding up his finger. The finger is the definition of justice. It isn't justice, it merely points toward justice. And justice, like the other virtues, are reflections of the light of wisdom, which shines down on us from the heavens to light our path through this dark night in which the sun itself is hidden from us. I've already mentioned courage earlier in this discussion. Courage is necessary in order to follow the path of virtue. The world is not ruled by virtuous men. Although the virtuous life is its own reward, and although I believe the path of virtue ultimately brings great rewards, there are many perils along the path. It can be dangerous to stand for wisdom in a world ruled by ignorance, or to stand for justice and temperance in a world ruled by excessive greed and unbridled lust. Evil rulers who use fear to manipulate and control the masses see men and women of courage as a threat to their power. They will hate you and seek to destroy you. And so courage is one of the cardinal virtues. Without courage, you can't have any of the others, because the others all require courage. Really, to develop any one virtue, you have to develop all of them. And a person who falls into one sin is likely to fall into all of the others as well. I talked about this in my video, Why I'm Against Fat Acceptance. I want to recommend a daily practice or a kind of meditation. Think about the cardinal virtues as you go through your day. When you're considering a course of action, ask yourself whether it's just. Is a lack of courage keeping you back from doing what you know is right? Before you go to sleep every night, reflect on the day. Consider whether your actions and choices were virtuous. In what ways did you miss the mark? The point isn't to beat yourself up or feel guilty. Don't dwell on your failures. Give yourself credit for your victories too. Even small steps in the right direction bring you closer to your destination. Remember that none of us are perfect, but we're capable of making progress. Are you moving toward perfection or toward corruption? Every step you take moves you closer to heaven or hell. As you ascend toward heaven, you lift the world up with you. As you descend into hell, you drag the world down with you. For your own sake, and for the sake of the world, choose your path wisely.